What is your point of view of the proposal to delist wolves across the U.S. with exceptions for red wolves and Mexican wolves? And we will take Larry, Mike, and Ed. Larry.
You know, we have to face up to the fact that the goal of the Endangered Species Act is to bring species to a point where they can sustain themselves in the wild, and at that point, there's a shift in the trust responsibility from the federal government to state governments. I think we also have to recognize, though, that there's a continuing federal oversight in that process. A delisting under the Federal Endangered Species Act does not mean a complete absence of protection or management and a complete absence of involvement of the federal system. A delisting means that there's at least a 5-year review period where there's close oversight of the federal government over the management actions that are taken by the states. There's close oversight and monitoring of those populations. And if the states do a poor job, it will be right back on the endangered species list. On the other hand, if the states do a good job, then the Endangered Species Act has done the job it was intended to do. When you look at the numerical increases in gray wolves in the Northern Rockies and the Great Lakes region, it's hard to argue that it isn't time to consider that delisting. When you look at the Mexican wolf, the story is very much different. We have a long way to go. Unlike my colleague here, Michael Phillips, I do believe that to get the job done with Mexican wolf is going to take a binational effort. I do believe that we can keep wolves on the ground, that we can sustain the Mexican wolf in the U.S., but to achieve what this act would call recovery and achieve what we would all be proud of is going to take work in Mexico also. But I believe that there are merits, there are pieces of the proposal that need work, but I have great hope and I think it has merit.
All right, Mike.
The vision has 4 parts, and I'll go through each part individually. The proposal to list Canis lupus bailey, the Mexican wolf, as endangered makes great sense. I agree with Larry, work should be done in Mexico, but that will be, in my mind, restoration work that should be celebrated, but I fail to see how it can in any way contribute to recovery in the United States. There's some real physical problems, and then there's some regulatory problems as well. Listing bailey as endangered makes great sense. Delisting Canis lupus occidentalis in the Northern Rocky Mountains makes great sense. Considering occidentalis in the Northern Rocky Mountains connected to the Northwest makes great sense. There's not sufficient discreteness to say the Northwest by itself should stand apart. So, as far as I'm concerned, me and the feds are 2 for 2. Considering Canis lupus lycaon, or specifically Canis lycaon, as a new taxonomic entity, gee whiz, maybe that makes sense. I suspect the taxonomists will probably conclude it doesn't. But the feds have said there may be this new wolf out there, Canis lycaon, and we need to take a look at it. And so they're proposing to do that. More study on lycaon. The final piece, Canis lupus nubilis. It's the eastern gray wolf, supposedly, the timber wolf, lives in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and drifts west, goes down into Colorado, and pulls back up to the northwest. They're saying it's recovered. I'm saying that they only can consider it recovered if they equate range from the law, significant portion of range, with current range, and they say nubilis is secure because in its current range it's secure. Most of nubilis's current range is in Canada. It hasn't counted until now. It really shouldn't count, not for the United States Federal Endangered Species Act. If you look at nubilis range-wide in the U.S., it occupies about 12% of its historical range. Moreover, there's never even been a recovery plan prepared that looks at the majority of nubilis's historical range. So I think it's premature to consider Canis lupus nubilis recovered. At a minimum, it should be relisted as threatened, a recovery team assembled to develop a plan that says, here's what range-wide recovery would look like for Canis lupus nubilis. So I'm about 3 for 4 with the federal government's proposal.
And Ed?
Well, the delisting rule is a pretty interesting thing, and I'm looking at Dave here because I think it was, what, late 90s, 2000, when we were, I think maybe Jamie was there in DC talking about recovery and trying to figure out how you deal with success. And the service is struggling with that. It's what happens when the ESA is no longer the best way to manage 5,000 wolves in the Midwest. How do you do that? That's a very difficult issue. And so the service has tried different approaches to this. This latest effort, which I helped draft early portions of, but I disagree with the final product on several levels, but we won't get into that. This agency has the right and the responsibility to listen to all the viewpoints and make the collective best decision it can. That's just the way this stuff works. And so I think the delisting package is a reasonable attempt to define what the Endangered Species Act is about and what the ESA recovery goal is about. Now, I personally believe that there are a lot more places you could have some wolves. And I believe that the ESA is certainly not the best way to get there. And so I personally support the majority of the idea that when you have a recovered population, that you should delist it. And I think the service is wrestling with that. I think there's so many legal technicalities involved with taxonomy and all the other stuff, it's going to be a hard road to hoe. But I give the service credit for trying to define what it thinks success is and what's the best model to go forward. And it is a pretty transparent, open process. It'll go through peer review, it'll certainly be litigated, and in the end we'll see whether it's successful or not. But I think the goal of saying this act can work, here's how, here's why, we're done, and we're transitioning it into another very successful conservation model. The service deserves credit for that.
All right, thank you.